So JD Vance winning the Ohio GOP Senate primary. Let's put this up there on the screen. He won with 33% of the vote. Coming in second was, interestingly enough, the polling did bear out, Krystal, that Dolan figure, the kind of not never Trump necessarily, but Trump skeptical and critical of January 6th.
He pushed back on the rigged election crap. That was what he really did.
Yeah, I mean, he was a multimillionaire. He spent many, many millions of dollars on the air. Josh Mandel, the most cringe character in the history of American politics, suffered a third-place defeat. I think all of America can unite on itself and saying that this clown who spent $30 million and put on a fake Southern accent losing is an unambiguously good thing. However, there's an interesting, really, test case here as to what this means. Now, Vance obviously is the favorite in order to win this election. Tim Ryan, I hope he can meditate his way to the top. Very unlikely, especially in the state of Ohio.
He's going to downward dog his way.
Right, he can downward dog his way to election. Good luck, bro. Whenever it comes to JD, as always, personal disclaimer, I've known him for years, and he is a friend of mine. So you can always look at my analysis through that. And I think it is always important that people who are in the news say that outright. However, I think it's very interesting here. Now, JD, I think, unambiguously ran a very Trump-ish style campaign. And I'm not talking about that economically. Now, I know JD. I've interviewed him several times on economics. He is about as close to me as any member of the sitting Senate would possibly be. That being said, his campaign was not really about economics.
No.
His campaign was about immigration, and it was about the culture war. Immigration was his #1 issue on this. And on the culture war specifically, he positioned himself as probably one of the most Trumpist-style candidates who was there. And I do want to say I do think that is authentically kind of where he is right now, because some skepticism around whether he's playing or acting. I can tell you through my personal interaction with him, I do believe that this is authentic. Now, that being said, it translates to how is JD going to be whenever it comes to Congress? And for that, it's interesting to look at the people who spent all this money against him, Krystal. We talked about how the Club for Growth came and attacked JD Vance, spending millions of dollars in order to try and destroy him. Now, it's fascinating that they were willing to do so, because if you look at JD and Josh Mandel and Mike Gibbons and the others, none of them really differ on the cultural front. So clearly this was about economics, or at the very least, it was about fiscal policy. They saw JD very much, as a character who kind of is against the economic orthodoxy of the Republican Party, and they were willing to spend many, many, many millions of dollars to try and hit him. That could be an indication of how JD is going to govern. I can tell you, I have no idea. The incentives in Congress are not to where I would like to see JD govern as a senator. Yeah. I was telling you before we went on the air, Senator Hawley, like a week ago, said, well, maybe we'll raise corporate taxes. Not we will, like maybe. The freak out here in Washington and amongst his GOP colleagues in the behind the scenes level was in a way that you can barely comprehend. So the stars are not aligned in order to vote in the economically populist direction.
Yeah.
Right? The incentives in the GOP, and you can see this, MTG and Matt Gaetz flew down to Ohio in order to campaign for JD for a reason, and a lot of MAGA people because they believe he's there with them on culture. Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't give a goddamn about industrial policy, okay? Let's all be very honest about what's going on here. So, the incentives in the party, and the reason Trump, frankly, even endorsed him in the first place, I don't think has anything to do with economics. I think it has to do with the fact that Trump likes that he's famous, and he likes that he's smarter than Josh Mandel. And, JD's willing to basically supplicate himself to Trump and say, I'm sorry that I, didn't vote, or I said I wouldn't vote for you in 2016. He's like, he made a mistake, but he's owned up to it. So the real question to me is, how does this all work in practice? And honestly, I don't know. He's going to have a tough time. I don't think there's any question about it. Like, the amount of institutional money which is allied against this perspective here makes it so that it's very, very convenient. I mean, you can look no further than Holly. It's much easier to be the January 6th warrior than it is to be the guy pushing the antitrust bills. Now, can you use one in order to give yourself cover on the other? I don't know. I honestly have no idea how that's going to play out.
Yeah.
We'll do our best. I'm going to do my best to try and stay objective here.
Yeah, I think it's correct to be highly skeptical that there will be much break from GOP orthodoxy on economic issues because, look, Hawley is the perfect example here. Shortly before January 6th and the fist pumping and going all in on that nonsense, he was working with Bernie on a new round of checks.
$2,000 stimulus checks.
What did
he didn't get a lot of credit for that, by the way.
What did the base reward him for?
Yeah, January 6th.
What did the base reward him for? It was for the fist pump on January 6th.
He raised more money on that than anything he's ever done in his career.
So, I mean, that tells you everything about the political landscape and the incentives. And, you know, I'm especially highly skeptical that someone who didn't run on anything that was economically heterodox really from the base and who focused exclusively on culture war is suddenly going to turn around once they're in office and be different. Because the reality is there's always an excuse. There's always an excuse of like, well, you don't understand because now I've got to run for re-election and, you know, it's already, and I've got to be able to raise money and they're going to come after me. And there's always an excuse for why you can't do the right thing. And, oh, you outsiders just don't ultimately understand. Now, the interesting thing to me also was the way that the media portrayed Vance, Mandel, and Dolan. And actually, I was just looking at the results. On election night, Dolan was ahead of Mandel. Now it looks like Mandel may have just eked out ahead of him for second place. So I do want to give him his due.
All right.
Very close. But anyway, Dolan was considered the moderate candidate. And Mandel was considered like to the right of him and very far right. And Vance was considered the most far right.
Yes.
I mean, the only thing you could really say about them that is different from a policy perspective at this point in terms of how they ran is just what they said about Trump and how they oriented themselves vis-a-vis Trump. So not only is the Republican base sort of judging candidates based on how loyal they are to Trump, but the media also judges them in that way. The only one of these three that you have any shot, even if it's a 1% chance of doing something different on economics, like maybe supporting antitrust or supporting some sort of like modest corporate tax hike or supporting some sort of, you know, relatively small child tax credit or something like that. The only one of the three that you have any chance of that with is JD, which is why the Club for Growth spent millions of dollars ultimately against him. They see that there is a somewhat of a possibility that he could buck them on some economic things that are core to their terrible, like elite libertarian type policy, pro-corporate policy. So when you look at it from that perspective, where you lined these guys, where the media lined these guys up on the spectrum really doesn't make any sense. But it tells you everything about the only divide that like matters in Beltway media. And it's all about—
Yeah, they don't know how to tell this story that we're trying to
Not
tell.
at all.
Yeah.
And it's not just on the Republican side, like, you know, anyone who became an opponent of Trump, no matter what they thought, no matter what wars they supported, no matter how many corporate tax cuts they're on board, no matter what they think about anything, then, you know, they're on the correct side and they're put on this side of the political spectrum. And then it's the same thing with the Republican candidates here. It's just all about, you know, how you orient yourself to Trump. And that's how they put you on how far right on the spectrum you are. So it was very revealing in that way. You know, I thought the sound we got from Jordan Chariton when he was on the ground there, from some of the voters who were coming out of a JD Vance event and explaining why they liked him, I thought it was very instructive that every single one of them basically said, like, listen, he owned up to his quote unquote mistake in criticizing Trump. And I do think that with this particular race, probably what happened is there was a natural affinity towards JD. He is from, you know, he has a deep understanding of especially rural Ohio, actually the, you know, area that I used to live in, Ohio, that's been decimated, that is basically Appalachia. So there was kind of a natural affinity towards him, but there were questions about whether this guy's really on our side. And so Trump created a permission structure for people who wanted to vote for JD to go in that direction. Yes. Of course, he had Peter Thiel backing him and providing that support for him to get through the stretch when he was not doing well in this campaign, ultimately. And so Trump, no doubt, was the kingmaker in this race. I don't think there's any question about it. But you found this, Saagar, which is very interesting. It's not working out quite the same way down in Georgia. And so the Trump effect is a little more complex than the storyline might be coming out of this race in Ohio, where he definitely decided, like, JD's the guy, and then it ultimately happened. Go ahead and put this tear sheet up on the screen. Right now, Kemp is running away with the nomination in the GOP primary. He's at nearly 60%. Purdue is down at 21%. So, I mean, he's getting curb stomped right now. And remember, Kemp was, you know, not just like has offered some rhetorical pushback to Trump and stop the steal and all this. I mean, he was very strong in saying, we're not going down this path, and, very clear. Trump was over the top in condemning him. And Georgia voters are like, that's nice, but we still prefer this dude over your, David Perdue.
See, I think this is interesting because everybody's like, oh my God, this shows that the Republicans will just do what Trump wants. Well, Ohio is Trump country. It's a Trumpy state. So they're obviously going to be the most loyal to him. But then in Georgia, a state that he lost, well, they're not so Trumpy. So it just shows you that there's like a real polarization happening in the Republican Party. And actually, they even had an exit poll of Vance voters, or people who voted in Ohio. Only 60% of Ohio GOP primary voters said that they wanted Trump to run again. Now, obviously, that's a majority. But it also shows you 40% were like, no, I don't think so. Now, those 40% will probably all vote for Trump if he did win the nomination.
Sure, yeah.
But it just shows you're like, okay, so the enthusiasm isn't that strong even in the state of Ohio. So what I would point to is this. Trump's endorsement matters a ton if you live in Trump country. If you live in Georgia, or if you live in Arizona, or if you live in, so any of these other states where Trump himself is not the dynamic, like animating figure for Republican politicians, then his endorsement either doesn't matter or it actually could backfire on you. At the very least, it's not enough in order to carry you across the finish line.
Certainly.
As evidenced by Perdue. So it's a way that you need to adjust your thinking when thinking like, oh my God, these Republicans will just vote for whoever Trump says. It's like, well, not necessarily. It's a mixed story.
I think it's also, I think there are some other factors at play too. So like, Josh Mandel was an annoying, terrible candidate who almost got in a fist fight on a debate. So in Georgia, you have Kemp, who is an incumbent governor. I mean, also don't downplay the power of incumbency. And people have some experience with him and who he is and what it's like to live in Georgia with him as governor, separate and apart from whatever Trump's opinion is. Whereas with the GOP primary field in Ohio, it's kind of more unformed. People probably had fewer opinions about the candidates who were in play. So in that kind of a wide open arena where you have no incumbent and where people maybe don't have like fully formed, really strongly held views about the different candidates, and it's Trump country, then you throw Trump into the mix, and it's going to be an extraordinarily powerful endorsement. Especially when you backed up with, Tucker was also very influential in keeping JD on the air and really sort of pumping him up in terms of the GOP base. In Georgia, you've got an incumbent who apparently is still popular among the Republican base. They like, I couldn't tell you the specifics of what he's done that people like, but apparently people like more or less what he's done as governor, at least on the Republican side. And so they were able to make an independent judgment, separate and apart from whatever it was that Trump wanted them to do. And, in fact, as this race has gone on, Kemp has opened up more of a lead. So now it looks like it won't even go to a runoff very likely. So, it's fascinating. And I think the bottom line is that the Trump effect is a little more complex than probably the media would ultimately have you believe coming out of the JD Vance story.
Absolutely.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.